Right. Okay, so welcome everyone today. So this is a topic that has been, near and dear to me for a little while now. I wrote a blog post about this several months ago, and of course, Sacha Thompson did the same thing. So this generated a lot of interest on LinkedIn, and we wanted to talk about it amongst a group of us. So let me introduce everyone first before we get started. So I'd like to start off with Stefanie Bowers. Let me just pull her info here. All right, so Stefanie is the Director of Equity for the City of Iowa City and adjunct instructor at the University of Iowa Center for Human Rights. Ms. Bowers graduated from the University of Iowa with a Bachelor of Arts degree and holds a Doctor of Jurisprudence from the University of Iowa's College of Law. She has been licensed to practice in Iowa since 2003. In her spare time, Ms. Bowers serves on numerous civic, community, and professional boards and is a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Her 15 years professional experience includes providing strategies, planning, facilitation, and development of government work on racial equity and engagement for the present and long term. Her work includes enforcement and protection of Iowa's city human rights ordinance. Welcome, Stefanie.
Thank you.
And Sacha Thompson. Many of you have seen her blog post, as I mentioned, and she's very active on social media. She's actually the founder of the Equity Equation LLC, a diversity coaching and consulting firm based in the Washington, D.C. area. With nearly 20 years of experience within education, nonprofit, and tech industries, Sacha has seen the challenges faced by executives with good intentions struggling to make decisions around diversity, where executives are motivated to do the right thing regarding DEI, but may be hindered by their own biases and fears. She's also seen and experienced the damage endured by BIPOC employees when they feel not centered or valued in their company's DEI efforts. Sacha's work is about removing barriers and providing support in order to get to a place of equality. She helps executives and leaders that have made meaningful dialogue and coaching them to necessary long-term changes that develop institutional cultures of DEI. Sacha is a certified professional diversity coach and 4 stages of psychological safety certified coach. She's received her bachelor's degree in sociology, concentrating on cultural diversity and ethnicity, a master's in educational policy and planning and leadership from the College of William and Mary. She's also acquired an MBA from Johns Hopkins University, where she's focused on management and marketing. Thank you, and good afternoon and good morning and good evening to some of you who are out on the other side of the world. So before anything, I just want to give a land acknowledgement, as I always do with all the podcasts. So I'll begin with the Urban Equity Tracks by acknowledging that we are meeting on Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to be here, and we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. As we gather here today, there have been Aboriginal peoples who have been the stewards of this place. In particular, I acknowledge the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, the territory covered by Upper Canada treaties and directly adjacent to the Halibut Treaty territory. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. So as we begin, I just want to do one little poll here. As you see here, it's coming up now. I just want to know roughly, where does EDI fall within your organization? I'm just going to let it go for about 30 seconds, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So I just want to, once we get everyone ready. And we're almost there. Couple more seconds. Okay, we're going to close it. So as we see here, we see that many of you fall into the other category. And that's very interesting, given the fact that EDI work permeates throughout the organization and where it should be there. So in essence, this is a conversation of, for the people that had answered in terms of human resources. First, let's open up the floor and talk about. Oh, there's Katrina now. Hi, Katrina. We're just getting started.
Oh, good. I'm so sorry to be late. I could not find the Zoom for this.
Oh, okay. No worries. No worries. We're just getting started. So basically, let's talk about the history of equity and inclusion work. This is something that, and it's been historically within EDI work. I know Sacha, Katrina, and Stefanie, we talked about this briefly in our pre-chat. So why don't you go through the history and tell us why EDI work has been housed or historically been housed in human resources.
Who would you want to answer that?
Anybody, Sacha, Katrina, go ahead.
Goodness, well, I mean, I can start, and I definitely would love for Stefanie and Katrina to join in. When you think about where this really began, it was kind of in the 1960s with the civil rights movement and everything that was happening in the world around us. And so it started with affirmative action, or what we've now called affirmative action. And organizations took that up as a people thing, right? So it was about how do we increase the number of Black people in particular in our organizations. And so as that kind of took on, what affirmative action did was expanded a little bit beyond Black employees. It expanded to other marginalized groups. And then over time, it became diversity and inclusion. There may have been some other terms that came out through the years, but it hasn't been, I would say probably the last 10 years has really been diversity and inclusion. Equity has probably come up within the last 5 or so. It's a constant evolution of what this work is and where it lands, but historically it is focused on people and hiring processes. And so it's, where does it go now in this next iteration of this work? So I don't know, Stefanie or Katrina want to add anything to that?
Yeah, hi everyone. I would just building on what Sacha shared, this began as an outcome or as a direct result of the Civil Rights Act and affirmative action, springing out of that to, and in part as a compliance-based to close equity gaps in both the hiring, the promotion of underrepresented communities and underrepresented talent within organizations. DEI or D&I, as we know, has been around since yes, the 60s, since the first ERGs that sprung up at IBM from Black employees who were, advocating and also challenging their the organization because of their experience, and they weren't getting promoted. They weren't getting the same opportunities as their peers. And that's how, the first employee resource group started, and affirmative action, of course, being tied to that as a mandate. And, it lived in HR because that is where, in part, like that's where the action is. That is where people are getting hired, promoted, where compensation decisions are happening, are being made. And so all of that context is important as we think about how this continues to evolve from an organizational design perspective, and where it sits and why it sits where it sits. And looking at the history and also what we have seen in recent history, and outcomes that are and are not being met through this work.
So then it becomes a challenge of, why organizations are still doing this. And, on the flip side with Stefanie, for instance, Stefanie is actually, her area, it's housed in there, but what become the challenges? What are the challenges of organizations who want to move into that direction? What have we seen? I mean, Stefanie, talk about your experience first in terms of like, in terms of the work that you're doing, and tell us specifically, why you feel that there could be benefits, and then we'll go on to the challenges as to why people are resistant to having it in a leadership role.
Sure. So at the City of Iowa City, I report directly to the city manager. And as Andre said, we have an Office of Equity and Human Rights. And so while I think HR obviously has a very important role in advancing DEI, I also think that their role is more looking at it from a staff perspective. So hiring, retention, promotions, salaries, making sure that staff are abiding by the DEI policies that the city has in their handbook, and evaluating city staff on how they're implementing that within their workspace. My role is a little different. I work with city departments and divisions to advance equity, specifically racial equity, into their daily operations. So using a racial equity lens to review their policies, services, and programs. And what we use is what we call the 5 areas of focus for relationship building, which are accountability, conversations, training, outreach, and justice. And so we use that to build upon equity. And then we also, and this would be different than human resources looking at DEI, we publish an annual report on racial equity. And that allows us to determine whether the strategies that we are using to reduce inequities within our system are actually working. And then we also use it as a tool to be accountable to our community. And so in that sense, my role is more incorporating it into the daily practices of city operations, where I think human resources is more about following or abiding policies that are on the books as it relates to DEI work.
So then to the panel, I mean, this sounds great, but at the same time, we're still seeing some sort of resistance, and then we're seeing a whole bunch of factors that are permeated through the organization when HR reports to EDI reports to EDI. When it reports to HR, or it reports to any other type of or type of organizational part of the organization. So what are the challenges here? Why do we still continue to see this? I mean, I know it's prominent here in Canadian municipalities and Canadian organizations where they do report to HR. But what are the challenges of this? Why are we still seeing this in organizations, whether it's private, public, or nonprofit sector? So anyone can answer that. Yeah.
I want to just acknowledge the contrast in what Stefanie shared about the work that she's doing within the city, within the government, because there's an accountability piece. And when we talk about why we're seeing the challenges we're seeing, why we're seeing resistance, that accountability piece is a primary reason why, that there is real accountability. And Stefanie, as somebody who's been internal in this work and leading this work internally within tech and companies like in the private and corporate sector, it's that accountability that often that's the piece that's missing, that there is not sufficient accountability, or the accountability is in words only. We're starting to see more accountability tied to, for example, compensation, where someone or a piece of someone's compensation is directly tied to meeting specific DEI related goals, specifically in representation and hiring, maybe even in promotions, et cetera. But there's not enough of that. And the work often relies upon the goodwill that people are doing this because they, in their heart of hearts, believe that this work matters, that it's important. The roles themselves, DEI roles, often are expected to lead with influence without any institutional authority or power. And so you're expected to influence, for example, the way a policy is constructed or how a policy is enacted. But you don't have the actual authority or agency to create or to drive a change to a policy if you see and the organization sees that the impact is unfair or there are disparities. That's what's missing. And so that lack of accountability, that this work is often seen as a pillar of advisement versus a critical pillar of how the organization's talent practices are structured, of how they are, enacted throughout the employee life cycle. Those are some of the pieces that are missing, as well as that accountability, that if the work fails, who does that fall on? It often falls on the people leading the work versus the heads of an organization, the leadership. They're not the ones who end up holding the bag when the work is not effective.
And I just wanted to piggyback on that. And, as Stefanie was talking, what clicked for me and Katrina picked up on it was there's a lack of checks and balances, right? So if it's within HR, solely within HR, there is no accountability, right? Or it's limited accountability. And so it also speaks to the maturity of the organization in this work. Because again, if you're just keeping it within the internal systems, it makes sense that it's within HR because it's people, processes, it's all of those things that are internal. But to Stefanie's point, her constituents are external, right? It's the community. And so that's where this work actually is going. That's kind of the 2.0 of EDI work. It's not just internal, it's how are you impacting your consumers, your customers, the communities that you serve, the industry that you're a part of, and what is your contribution to diversity, equity, inclusion in those spaces? It's not just what's happening within your walls. And so I think what we saw in 2020 was a big push for that, right? You can't put out these empty statements anymore stating, oh, we're doing all these wonderful things, because now your employees are holding you accountable and saying, guess what? We ain't being treated the same way that you're talking about. Right. And so now there's a level of accountability that's being forced into place that can no longer be held by HR, legal, and PR. Right. And so now what does it look like when we talk about accountability? What are we measuring? And so those are the conversations that we really need to start having outside of just people and processes. So I just wanted to kind of touch back on to what Stefanie said there too. Thank you.
And I'm going to pick a little bit more, Sacha, because you know how we do. There's also, and I hear this in what Stefanie's saying about whom are you centering in this work?
Yes.
So, Stefanie, as you talk about accountability, I'm curious about, whom you're accountable to as you are reporting out about what equity looks like, and how does that accountability and the people, the groups that you are centering, how does it align to your values as a company, as an organization? And it sounds like there, is both a values aspect that the government is committed to, as well as there's clarity around whom you're centering when we talk about equity. When we talk about equity, we're specifically talking about closing gaps. And those gaps are often evidenced in communities that have been historically underinvested, marginalized because of our policies and practices centering white supremacy.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that the reason that the city started looking at racial equity specifically was driven by the community demanding that of their local government. So the city started looking at racial equity seriously in February of 2012 after the murder of Trayvon Martin. So like communities across the country, people in Iowa City were demanding some type of accountability on the part of the local government to fight against injustices. And so since that time, advancing racial equity has been one of the strategic goals of the city council. And so while there are days where it's a struggle. not going to say this work is easy. It does help to have that leadership component to this work, because anybody who is employed by the city of Iowa City, it's very clear to us ultimately who we report to. And so we know that this is a strategic plan of theirs, and it's our responsibility to make sure that we incorporate that into our work for the city.
Yeah, and those are all important points. We're seeing that there needs to be a response to this, but at the same time, Sacha, you talked about a lot of things on your LinkedIn post from a couple of weeks ago, leading up to this this session, and when you talk about that, you talked including there's stuff about dysfunction, there was talk about toxicity, and kind of the lived experience. Basically, it's not necessarily negated, but put to the side a little bit when we're doing this work. So do you want to expand on what you meant by all of that when you were talking about that post? And of course, there was a lot of reaction to it from HR folks and from other people who think otherwise. And of course, Katrina's the old school. She used to be she has that HR lens. So so let's go with that. Sacha, go ahead. Let me go right ahead.
That's a great way for me to preface this, right? I have friends in HR, right? So it's not that I hate HR or the industry. I just believe that that is not the sole place for this work to live in order for it to be successful. And so when I did the post, I guess it was last week or the week before, I also want to say I sit in a very unique position in that as a coach, I coach two groups of people: diversity practitioners that are actually doing the work in these organizations, and underrepresented people that are parts of these organizations. And so I see the disconnect of what's happening. I see that companies are making all of these statements around diversity and inclusion, and they have wonderful and great efforts going out there, but there's very little to change some of the policies and procedures that are in place that uphold, as Katrina spoke to, white supremacy, or that keep inequity in place, right? There's very little to actually dismantle what's making things inequitable. And so what's happening is you're having underrepresented people go into HR to say, hey, I'm experiencing some type of discrimination. And what they are getting in return is this, how do we protect the company stance, right? That's not what's being said to them, but the process in place is we need to mitigate risk, right? And so how do we make sure that how we respond does not position us so that we can get sued? And it kind of centers the organization versus centers the person that is the victim. And what ends up happening is they experience gaslighting, right? So it's turned and flipped on them, like, well, maybe you're the problem, right? Or maybe, your leadership skills need to be improved, or, so it's totally turned around, and that person is like, well, wait a minute, this is what's happening to me. And so then they think it's just a one-off. What's some of the data that's not being collected, or if it is being collected, is how many of these one-offs are actually happening and who are they happening to, right? So those are the patterns, but you can't be the judge and jury. And so that's part of the reason why I think that this work needs to be separate from HR, because there needs to be someone that holds them accountable for having some of these systems in place that uphold this inequity, right? So if it's within the same place, it's easier to hide. But if you have someone within a leadership role that can say, hey, this is how your process is inequitable, right? Now we can have a conversation at a leadership level on how we fix this for the organization. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from, where I came from with my post, in that some of these diversity efforts are seen as failing because your Black and Brown employees, or employees that are from marginalized groups, are seeing the PR, but they're not experiencing the impact of what those efforts are supposed to do. And so there's a disconnect there that I think that if there was some separation between the two, you could start building some of those bridges.
I know Katrina wants to chime in for that.
No, I'd start when Sasha was talking. I was talking about some of having HR friends. I heard some of my best friends are HR. I think there's, that's valid. That is absolutely valid in the experiences that so many people are having, where they go to HR because they're experiencing poor treatment or mistreatment from a supervisor or multiple people. And HR's focus is often minimizing risk for the company. And let's be real about this, that is in plenty of companies, that's the function of human resources, is to manage and to mitigate that risk. So the human has been taken out of human resources, of people, as a function, in that it is now about protecting an entity, a company. It becomes about, and thusly protecting an entity, a company, and also the leadership, because that's also part of it. And we don't see lots of examples where, and certainly not lots of, widely known or very visible, where a company and thus HR has decided to immediately has a zero tolerance policy for bad behavior, and the kind of bad and sustained behavior that impacts people from and people who hold multiple marginalized identities. And I think this is an opportunity, just what the topic of this forum is about. This is an opportunity to imagine the function of people, of HR, differently, to think about it differently. What would it look like if HR as a function was really focused on improving the experience? Yes, within an organizational context, and improving that experience means that when people are experiencing microaggressions, when they're experiencing harm, that there is a proper recourse for them that doesn't involve just, putting your head down and working harder or growing thicker skin, and that those people who have been the people perpetuating the harm just are, will go away, or someone will talk to them, etc., without any real consequences, without any change. And I want to just pull that out, because I think in our societies, we have language, we have frameworks and processes around punishment, around specifically consequences, but we don't have language and frameworks around what repair looks like, around what it looks like to actually really support and embrace someone who has experienced that harm, and to make sure that they are well supported as they heal, as well as supporting that person who has been perpetuating a harm, to say, what you did was unacceptable, and it goes against our values, against our policies, and we want to help you to get better, to improve as a person, to change. And here's what that looks like. And you also have to be accountable for the harm that you've caused. Like, when I talk about envisioning HR, seeing it differently as a function, that's what it could look like in my mind.
And that's a thing. And one of the things I want to touch on, I mean, anyone can answer this or anyone can talk about this too, is when you talked about the element of risk, a lot of times that leads to gatekeeping. And that becomes a critical factor here too, because when it's gatekeeping, you're just basically doing what you're told. You're not taking risks. You're not, you're putting your head down and letting things permeate, letting the macroaggressions, the racism that continue to exist in an organization. So, how do we get away from that? And that's something, that's another thing that we're starting to see within this industry, is because of the fact they want to keep their jobs, right? And that doesn't mean anything when you're doing this work. So what are we doing? What are we doing to change this? And that's something that we need to discuss here or unpack.
I think Katrina touched on it though, right? It's like, how do we shift not just language, but
Right.
how do we shift behavior and culture, right? And so if there's this fear-based culture, which is a big part of corporate culture, right? American corporate culture, I'll say. That's where it's always fear-based. And so how do we shift that to almost an abundance mindset where it's like, okay, how do we do this where we're truly supporting everyone that's involved? And that takes time. And, you know, Katrina actually had a conversation earlier today about, you know, I'm even changing how I approach this work in doing culture changes. Like I'm not doing workshops anymore because that's just easy to make a checkbox, right? Yep, we did a workshop on anti-bias or anti-racism, whatever. But how have you changed the culture? How have you changed behavior? And so that's, I think, is the next iteration of this work, is really looking at organizational change and how do we shift behaviors, but not make it always punitive, right? There's a way to coach people into increasing their EQ, coach people into building up their leadership abilities and skills, and doing so in a way that everyone benefits, and it's always not seen as detrimental to someone's career. And so it's a fundamental shift in mindset that we need to take on. But by doing that, you also have to have some, again, checks and balances in there. Because if people want to go back to this old culture because they benefited from that, then what do we do to prevent that from happening, right? What's the incentive for them to move forward? And so again, it has to be a cultural shift that takes place across the organization. But that's going to be the only way that we can do that.
And Stefanie, you'd like to add anything to that?
No, I think I would just agree with that. I mean, I think it's more than just having policies and a mission or a vision for DEI and advancing inclusion, belonging. I think that there has to be specific concrete strategies that an organization takes to make sure that that happens, and not just have it kind of as something that they advertise, but I think they need to really make it reality. And some of the ways you do that, I mean, you have to somehow assess, you know, your workplace. You have to talk to the employees of that particular workplace, and you need to have conversations. And from those conversations, there should be specific action that an organization or company takes to address those concerns or issues that a person is having in the workplace.
Sure, that's great to hear. And then now it's, you know, now we're seeing this this happen. So I do have a question from the audience here. Maybe one of you or all of you can answer this. So how do you work on convincing leadership that culture change is DEI work? They see it as two different things. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I think that's it's an interesting take, because it's so not separate at all. The culture is the underpinning of your organization. It is what the day-to-day experience looks like. And it's measured by, yes, engagement surveys. It's measured by the feedback that people say and insights and experiences that they have about, you know, how they work and how they work with their colleagues, and what their day-to-day looks like, both the good and the bad. And that is your culture. It is the way. It's not just what you do. It's not just this is our output, but it is how you do the work. And in every organization and every society, there are rules, right? There are unwritten rules, there are explicit rules, and your culture is often in those unwritten rules. And that's when you talk about the experiences that people have, that's where your culture is. And that's where you can focus, and you'll see it, right? Like, so the signals and the ways to answer this question directly, the ways that you convince people are, you start with the data and looking at, yes, attrition data. You look at data from your recruiting pipeline, because those are the signals that you can look at and look for those signals, excuse me, that also speak to your culture. So who's coming into the organization? What are communities that you would like to bring in, and talent, for example, Black and Brown talent, white women, women of color, what are they saying about your organization? That's your reputation, which is directly tied to your culture. And so using that data as signals, if you've got high attrition, for example, amongst certain groups, that tells you that there is often something in that. And the way that you get that data and mine that data and expand it as well is through talking to people. So lots of one-on-one interviews. If it's focus groups, that you will get some amazing insights from that you can then use and tell a story to leadership to say, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion, hello, that is about culture. That is about, do I feel welcome here? Is there a level of psychological safety that allows me to show up and to bring my brilliance and myself into this work? Do I feel like I can challenge people safely? Do I feel like I can speak up with contrary opinions that go against the majority, et cetera? That is where your culture lives, exists. Those are all of the signals, the feedback, the insights that will tell you also where to look and where people are experiencing your culture in a really negative way that you can and should address through whatever you're doing from a strategic imperative within DEI.
It's like Katrina just took all the words out of my mouth. All the words. Because what I wrote down was like culture equals inclusion, right? And so that also signals to me that your organization may not have identified or defined what inclusion means for your organization, right? Some organizations say diversity, equity, inclusion, diversity, however they put the letters together, but don't define what each of those things mean. And inclusion is about your culture. You know, she spoke about some of the rules, the written and unwritten rules that define your culture. That tells you who's included and who's not. Right. And so that is a fundamental piece of those things being tied together. The second part that I was going to bring up that Katrina just wonderfully tied into this was psychological safety. Like in any of the workshops that I do around psychological safety, in the 4 stages, the first stage is inclusion. So when I'm working with clients and they're like, well, I don't understand how this ties to diversity and inclusion. I'm like, well, your team got a 4 on a scale of 1 to 10 on inclusion. So let's start there, right? If people are not feeling that they're valued, seen, heard, respected, then they're not going to challenge the status quo when they get to stage 4. Like there is no stage 4. And so how do you create environments that allow people to show up as humans, allow them to show up as themselves unapologetically? And do you have a culture that allows for that to happen? Or does your culture also make them hide parts of themselves because it is not accepted there, right? So those are the things when you talk about culture and you talk about inclusion, they're intricately tied together. And you cannot have one without the other.
That's true. And, you know, you can, and the thing is, what we tend to see too, is that, you know, we're trying to achieve equity, but that's, you know, as they say that, you know, it's the stepchild of this EDI work, because it's just the middle child and all that. So exactly, see? So that becomes problematic too in this work that we're doing. And, you know, when we're trying to be accountable to the communities that we serve, that becomes, you know, that becomes an issue. You know, Stefanie, what's your take on this?
I would echo everything that has been stated. One of the things that I guess I'd like to paint a picture that I think there are models where HR and equity offices can work together for an organization. So I personally have a very good working relationship with human resources at the city. And I think that does benefit us in terms of working together to identify areas in which there needs to be improvement. So I don't necessarily think it has to be one or the other, but some type of model where the two systems work together to create better outcomes for everyone versus, just HR or just the equity office. So I think it's a collaboration. And I have found that to be helpful because in my role, I'm not privy to discipline or things like that if there's been some type of misconduct, but they are. And so when we can meet up and just have general discussions about what some of their concerns or issues are from what they see from kind of the oversight that they have of city staff and combine that with what I'm trying to do, I think it does help us to better engage not only with the community, but with our staff too.
And, and one of the things I know we touch upon too, and I think, Sacha, I think you mentioned it on your blog or in one conversation, is there seems to be this move towards, corporate social responsibility and ESG work, and that they're shifting this DEI work not necessarily within the organization, but a separate entity of the organization. I know that we don't, when I started learning about this, I'm like, I've barely heard about it, and I know it's within the business community. I'm not sure if you've heard about it, Stefanie, in terms of the work in the public sector, but I know this is more on the business side. So why are we, just to kind of conclude and to move forward to the end of this in terms of stages, why are we seeing this happening now? It's almost like they're avoiding doing the work. So why are we seeing this happening? Anybody?
I think that's, and I'm going to ask you to just rephrase or repeat that. Why are we seeing like disengagement in this work? Or?
Well, it seems like there's, from what I've been reading is that there's a lot more a movement in terms of going, putting DEI work in that CSR, ESG kind of category, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So now there's a movement towards that. So why are we seeing this happening?
It's a trend. It's a trend, I think, and this is what happens. It's like the equity piece didn't exist in D&I, but even like 3 or 4 years ago, you didn't see the function titled as diversity, equity, and inclusion, or inclusion, diversity, equity, or anything like that. Equity wasn't necessarily a defined, explicitly called out piece of the naming convention of the work. And so I see this as potentially and probably another trend that, and it's also a way that people are thinking about the work, and there's a danger in it that pulling it into ESG, which is often, primarily external, that the work then, becomes more externally focused and less focused on the internal organization, which is the potential danger or challenge here. And I think, if this is also a way for ESG and for folks who are in this work to expand their scope and their remit, which is always going to be attractive. So I don't want to call it necessarily a bad thing or define it or label it with any particular judgment, but I think it is something that we need to watch and to think about. How does this work still continue to play out? And then again, to focus on how does this work really come to life in a way where there is accountability, where, folks who are still in these roles and leading this work are beyond and moving beyond influence to move to actually have real responsibility and have defined scope that may and should include some aspect of talent management and of talent practices, of policies, that is not just expected to shift, and they're not just expected to lead through influence. And so this is probably a mishmash in a response, but it's something to watch. It's something to see. How does this pick up? Does it pick up steam, or is this something that just a few companies will decide to reorg the function in that way? And it also allows us to think critically about, is this the right space? Where actually should this work be housed? And we've all talked about it being housed as a distinct function that's not in HR, that reports directly to the CEO or COO, and also has some remit for talent in some way.
I would agree. I'll piggyback on what Katrina said. I think that the pendulum like swings far and wide. And I think that this might be one of those wide ones that also some organizations are using as an arm of philanthropy. And so it's, if we just throw money at it, right? And we could say, we're contributing our part, then we're good, right? Well, that's just the same as putting a black square up on your social media, right? It doesn't really change anything. And so I always ask the question, if money was not an issue, if money was not on the table, what else would you be doing to impact the community or the industry that you're a part of, right? And it forces people to actually think about, okay, wait a minute, I can't throw money at things. Like, now we're talking about systemic change. Now we're talking about, how does your organization and the work that they specialize in, how can that impact marginalized communities, not only that are internal, but external, right? Your customer base. And so it becomes a conversation that pulls in other parts of the business, right? I came in, when I was in tech, I was in a marketing function. I wasn't tied to HR. I wasn't tied to recruiting. And my goal was to increase the number of underrepresented technologists in the industry. That was my remit. And it was a wonderful program, but because there was this block on where DEI should sit, right? There was very little support. Two, because I wanted it to be more than just gender-based, there was very little support, right? So you have to really understand like how much influence and impact you can also make as you're creating these programs. So ESG, or however, corporate social responsibility may be a good place to start, as Katrina said, but it also gives us the opportunity to say, okay, there are other parts of this business that need to be involved in this. And maybe this is just where we start, but it grows into something larger. And I think that is probably where the rebalance of that pendulum will end up. It's not just HR, it's not just corporate social responsibility. It is who we are as an organization, and how does this become a part of our DNA and what we do internally and externally.
So it sounds like we're just waiting and seeing what happens here at this point, right? In terms of this movement.
Or you can just do whatever you want to do.
Yeah, pretty much. So, and that's the situation. So, so I have a question here, which kind of would relate to how we're going to end this discussion. If there's any other questions, go ahead and type them in the chat, or even blurt out your question. But so someone had asked, what are some recommended steps to take in order to help an organization see that current methods and practices may be popular, but are performative and rudimentary in nature? So, going into, where do we move from here, basically? And, yes, we talked about the CSR ESG, but how do we move from here and going on towards, towards bringing equity to an organization and to the people within the organization? So if anyone wants to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting question to, one, there are some really great frameworks out there that you can leverage. So the one I always come back to with clients is Korn Ferry's definition of, and the spectrum of maturity for diversity and inclusion within organizations. Both Korn Ferry and Deloitte have a similar spectrum, but it shows you this is what it looks like at a basic level, for less mature organizations to more mature. And and you can share that to, and I will actually go grab it from off the internet and put it in the chat, but it's a great reference point. And I want to tie this back to a comment that Dr. Nate Dunlap Jr. made in the chat around giving definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because you have to level set with folks when you come into this work, because people don't know what it means. And I think as practitioners, we are in it, and sometimes we are so in it that we forget what it might be like for folks who are not in it at all, who don't understand what it is, whom just think about diversity simply as representation, right? And don't think about it beyond that, and who just were introduced to the idea of diversity and inclusion in around the summer of 2020 during the racial justice reckoning. So we've got to level set with people, and we've got to help them to understand this is what it looks like to really do this work, and to share some examples. And there's lots of content out there that will help you and can help you to anchor folks to what is this, what does diversity mean? What does equity mean? Inclusion. What does it look like at a basic level? What does it look like to be mature in this work? And you don't have to make all the same mistakes that other organizations have made. And this is where I always invite clients to, and I usually go through an exercise where I'm asking them, who is it that you want to be in diversity, equity, and inclusion? What is your vision that's specific to you? That's not just about training or just about, but it, you know, once you understand what DEI is, you understand beyond definitions, how does it relate to your values, and how are you defining what you want to be in this work? And I think when you do that, what I've seen is that when you do that, that allows people to separate themselves, to really define what this means in a way that is meaningful, and also gets you past some of the more performative and basic steps in this work. Nobody says that you have to be at step 1 and then proceed, you know, next step 2, step 3. You can always do something different. You just have to have the willingness, just as we are innovative in other spaces and willing to try and experiment. You have to be willing to do that in this space as well.
The one thing that I will say or add to that is most organizations are data driven. Like as they're doing this work, there's data. There's lots of data about it. Disaggregate that data. Because what ends up happening is you're looking at the data and you're like, oh, well, there are no problems. Like everything is great. Well, disaggregate it at the intersections of identity and see what story that tells. Because again, you know, as Stefanie mentioned, and as Katrina mentioned, keep in mind who you are centering in this work and look at the data for those identities and for those people, because that will tell you if you're actually being successful or not, or if you are just giving lip service to the work. Because if you are saying, hey, we're going to increase the number of women of color, and I'm just using that as a general term, right, in X area, and you look at and you know that the data for underrepresented, I'm using tech as an example, underrepresented in tech does not include Asian, right? And some aspects of Asian it does include. And so how are you looking at that data? Because if you add certain groups, it's going to give you something that's going to be much more pleasant and easier to swallow, right? Than if you were to pull out and say, let's look at Black, Native American, and Latino numbers in this group, right? Which typically are underrepresented in tech. That will tell you a very different story. So I always say, just aggregate the data, figure out kind of who you are not serving and how you can shift what you're doing to meet what the data is telling you. So I think that that's a big part of what people can do with information that you already have. The second part of that is kind of a part B to that, but it's on your exit surveys. If you are doing exit surveys, look at that information disaggregated as well too. Because if you start to see trends, if you start to see, okay, there's a commonality that's happening within some of these groups, then there's a gap that needs to be filled. And often what happens is we're looking at it in the aggregate and those voices get lost. And so it's easier to dismiss as a one-off because it's very few in a larger pool. But if you really pull those together or disaggregate that, again, you'll get a very different story.
And we'll conclude. Stefanie, any last comments before we close this off?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think important points were just brought up about using tools to determine kind of what your baseline is and really looking at those numbers. I think sometimes you can fall into a situation where an organization or company copies or mimics something that another organization or company did because it worked for them. But you really have to have a sense of your culture, your employees, your consumer base or your community in order to actually create equitable changes. You can't just do something because company A did it or company B did it. It's very unique to each organization and business. And I think that's using tools and looking at the information that you do have or gathering the information if you don't have it is the best way to begin work on DEI issues.
All right. Thanks for this today. I just want to conclude. Just want to find out where everyone's heads at today. You know, I said this to Sacha that I'm going to steal her line, and I'm going to do it. How do you fill your cup? Look at her face. How do you fill your cup for today, Friday? I mean, you know, today it's gloomy. It's actually snowing outside. Well, it's not snowing, but it's kind of snowing outside up here in the Hamilton GTA area. So just tell us how you fill your cup and tell us how they can find you. Go ahead, anybody.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute and trying to type in the chat. I am based out of Atlanta where, sorry, y'all, it's sunny today. Don't feel too bad because it'll probably rain again in a couple of days. Sunny and pollinated. I am filling my cup today by reveling in the fact that it's Friday, by getting up and I put on makeup today, which makes me feel good, and my favorite earrings, and just going to really spend a little bit of time just walking around barefoot and reconnecting with nature today. Happy Friday. Thank you for joining me, for joining us. You can find me on LinkedIn and also connect with me on Twitter. I'll put and Instagram, I'll put all my contacts in the chat.
Okay. Sacha?
So yeah, Andrew, we'll talk about this whole fill your cup thing. But this is my last day of the call of the day. So I am just going to enjoy this balmy, not so much, 56-degree weather outside, and just really enjoying the weekend and taking some time to reconnect. So, but thank you all to thank everyone. Andre, thank you for having us. That's my Fill Your Cup Friday post from today. So if anybody wants to, be a part of that, that would be great. And that's also, you can connect with me on LinkedIn there, or you could just follow me at the Equity Equation on Facebook, on Instagram, or connect to my website, theequityequationllc.com. And thank you all for coming. This has been fabulous.
And we'll leave it off with Stefanie.
Okay, thank you for this great opportunity. I want to thank the other panelists and also the participants who came to listen to this today. And it's Friday, so I'm going to try to get going on some work so that I can enjoy the weekend. And like Sacha and Katrina, I can be found on LinkedIn. So thank you.
All right, thank you. And that concludes today's Urban Equity Chats. Next week, we're going to have a discussion on self-care, topics of self-care, dealing with toxicity within the EDI profession. And that's something something that's really, really neat to discuss. I mean, for me, I will talk about it another time, but right now that concludes for today. Thanks everyone for joining in, chiming in. Thank you to Sacha, Katrina, and Stefanie for joining me and agreeing to doing this. It's been great. So thanks everyone, and have a good Friday and have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.